Every season, I end up adding more growing spaces and exploring different things as part of this Red Gardens project. This past year, we've continued this habit with a new polytunnel and a few large variety trials. But the most significant addition by far was the two big trials of growing potatoes in large grow bags. One trial involved growing early varieties of potatoes in a low-quality municipal compost that had been amended in different ways. The other trial involved growing a main crop potato variety in bags filled with the local topsoil that was amended in different ways, as well as in a range of different carbon-based growing medium. I learned a lot from these trials, with some interesting and disappointing results, a lot of which I've already explored in 5 other videos. But with 392 potato plants growing in 180 large grow bags with 28 different amendments or growing medium variations, there was a lot to learn. And I wanted to talk about 7 additional observations that I thought were really interesting that I haven't been able to really include in the other videos. This was the first year that I've ever done a trial of this kind of size before, and the first time I've grown in containers of any kind, and that was quite a learning experience. I learned that it is hard to keep enough water in the material of the grow bags to keep the plants happy, and not being able to water thoroughly enough during the warm and dry weather we had was probably one of the key limiting factors in the trials. I was disappointed with how small the crop was from a lot of the bags, but some of them were surprisingly big, especially when the plant roots in a few of the bags had been able to access a fertile and moist soil below. The plants we grew in the amended municipal compost were quite disappointing, and it really showed the limitation of using this bulk form of carbon within the gardens. This compost and a lot of the other amendments and growing medium types could probably have benefited from more time to mature, and I suspect things will be better next year. I was pleasantly surprised that simply filling the bags with the topsoil from underneath the composting area was one of the easiest ways to grow a big crop, and it shows that the local topsoil can definitely be improved. And it was great to see that a decent crop of potatoes could also be grown in a wide range of different forms of decomposing carbon or growing medium without the use of soil, something that I had not experienced before. There are definite limitations to a trial like this, as it is a controlled and intentionally constrained growing space. But this control allowed us to try a lot of different things quite easily, and allowed us to make a lot of interesting observations. The topsoil around here is based on a calcareous soil with a naturally high pH. And although we can still grow some great crops in it, this alkaline soil does cause some issues, including scab on the skin of the potatoes that we grow. I haven't worried too much about this over the years, as this common scab doesn't seem to affect the yields too much and can be easily peeled off, and we just got used to it. All of the batches of potatoes that were harvested out of the soil-based mixes in the grow bags had scab to varying degrees, but the potatoes grown in the bags that didn't include the local topsoil didn't have scab. This was the first time I've harvested potatoes without scab, and it is a definite benefit of using the municipal compost and other non-soil-based growing medium to produce potatoes. And it makes me wonder what I would need to do to the topsoil in our gardens to be able to grow potatoes with a lot less scab, and whether that kind of intervention would be worth it. While I have become very used to the scab on the potatoes, some of the main crop potatoes that we grew in this grow bag trial ended up having a black residue or growth on the skin that I don't remember coming across before. I think this might be called Black Scruf, which is a type of fungal disease, but I'm not sure. But the black marks can be scraped off the skin, and it didn't seem to affect the yield of the plants, so I wasn't so worried about it. But it was interesting that it seemed to happen randomly in about 1 out of every 6 bags, in both the different variations of the soil and in the carbon-based growing medium. So it didn't seem to be affected by what the potato plants were growing in, or at least I didn't notice any correlation or pattern, and I suspect it might have been brought in on the seed potatoes that I bought, or it could have something to do with growing in the grow bags themselves, and this is something I want to keep an eye on in the future. We didn't get any blight on any of the potato plants in these bags, which is the most common and serious potato disease around here, mainly because I've selected varieties that have been bred to be resistant to blight. And there were very little other signs of disease on the leaves or of the plants, but there were obvious discolorations caused by nutrient deficiencies in some of the bags, which I didn't address or correct, as I wanted to let the trial progress as it had started. So apart from the obvious fertility deficiencies, there were only 2 plants out of the entire trial that really struggled for some other reason. Both of these plants had weaker growth earlier in the season and then died off, and both of them were growing in the lightweight rooftop mix. I made this mix with a bagged growing medium mixed in with some municipal compost, perlite, vermiculite, and some general purpose fertility. The other plant in these 2 bags did really well with less competition, but the weight of the potatoes harvested from these 2 bags was definitely less than the other bags with the same soilless mix. And 2 of the other bags of this type of growing medium produced more than most of the other bags in this trial. So this rooftop mix can be really effective and productive, but also 2 plants died growing in it from what seems to be a disease or infection of some kind. And I don't know whether this is just a coincidence or if there is an issue with this mix of different materials. But not all fungal issues that we observed in this grow bag trial were necessarily problematic. When harvesting the potatoes from one of the grow bags, I noticed a strange discoloration in the material of one bag that had been filled with a professionally made growing medium or potting compost that I buy. A substantial portion of this growing medium was colonized by a fungi of some kind, which changed the color of the material and caused it to clump together, probably with the fungal mycelium. This didn't seem to affect the potatoes growing in the impacted section of the grow bag, and the yield was very similar to the other bags of the same type, which didn't have any signs of the same issues. But this fungal decomposition of the material will change it, and it will be interesting to see what happens when we grow plants in the same bag next year. This was one of the most obvious signs of decomposition of the material in the bags. But with all of the carbon-based growing medium, there was some decomposition over the season. In most cases, the texture and visual quality of the material changed quite a bit, and the volume reduced as well. It's hard to estimate how much the volume of this material changed, because I didn't fill all of the bags exactly to the same amount at the beginning of the season, and there would have been some shrinkage of the volume as the material initially settled. But at the end of the season, I needed to top up the material in the bags filled with different types of compost, including the many bags filled with the municipal compost. The spent mushroom compost and our own compost seemed to decrease in volume the most, but these materials were only partially decomposed at the beginning of the season. And in these cases, it was the continuing decomposition that seemed to release a lot of the fertility that enabled the potato plants to grow so well, which is a good reason for selecting this kind of material in the first place. In hindsight, it probably would have been a good idea to top up the levels of this material when the plants were still growing. Partway through the growing season, it was really obvious that some plants were doing a lot better than others, even though the plants were the same variety planted at the same time. The color of the leaves was one really good indicator, but it was the difference in the size of the plants that was most dramatic. In August, I decided to measure the length or height of one of the taller stems or haulms of the plants in each grow bag as something to be able to compare, and I figured it would probably relate to the size of the harvest. It made sense that the larger plants would produce a bigger crop, and when I compared the stem length measurements to the weight of the harvest from the same bag, there was a general correlation. Larger plants tended to produce a bigger crop, but the spread of the results was bigger than I would have thought. Some of this was due to a few of the plants dying off, or with some of the larger plants that seemed to be more stressed by a lack of water, and I suspect that some of the better yielding plants had roots that had been able to access the soil below. But there's also likely a lot more going on with all of this, as there are so many different variables that would cause a smaller plant to produce more than expected, and a larger plant to be disappointing. And a graph like this only shows me that there is a lot more to learn and understand. Another thing that we really noticed when we finally got around to emptying all of the grow bags to harvest the potatoes was a significant range in the number of potatoes that the different bags actually produced. And there was a lot of really small potatoes, which was really disappointing. But I also find this interesting, as I guess I had assumed that the plants of the same variety would all try to produce a similar number of potatoes, so there was something different going on here. It seems that in the bags that had a lot of fertility available at the beginning of the growing season, the plants grew quite quickly and grew really large and started to produce more potatoes. But when the fertility available in the limited volume of the grow bags began to run out, these plants were not able to continue to develop all of the potatoes that they had started, and I didn't top up on any of the fertility. In many cases, there was still a reasonable weight harvested, but with lots of quite small undeveloped potatoes at the end of the season. In some of the bags where there wasn't so much fertility available earlier in the season, the smaller plants started fewer potatoes. But as the material continued to decompose, the plants were able to continue to benefit from this release of fertility. And at harvest time, the individual potatoes ended up being significantly bigger on average, even though there were fewer of them. An extreme version of this was with the plants growing in hay, which grew very poorly at first, and some of the plants even died. But as the hay continued to decompose over the summer, the few potatoes that were started by the plants that survived were able to grow a bit bigger. In one case, there was only one potato in the entire bag of mostly decomposed hay at the end of the season, but it was possibly the biggest potato we harvested out of any of the grow bags. This one plant put all of its energy into this one potato. So, continuing to feed the plants in a lot of the bags later in the growing season would probably have helped most of the plants to continue to develop potatoes that they had started. And this could have significantly increased the yield. This was a very useful and rather simple thing to learn, and it's something that I'll have to take into consideration when I continue the trial next year. And it has caused me to rethink my fertility management strategies in the other gardens, as I now suspect a lot of the plants in the soil might do even better with supplemental feeding as the season progresses. Providing a much more consistent supply of moisture in the grow bags will also help a lot, which I plan to do with a dripper system next year. It makes sense, of course, that providing adequate water and nutrients to the plants will help them grow better. But these potato plant trials provided really good practical and visual examples of what happens when I don't provide the plants with everything they need, and how good things can get when I do. Each of the different growing mediums or amendment types can also be adjusted or refined for next year. But if I wanted to get the biggest crop out of the grow bags, it would make sense to let the roots of the plants have easy access to the fertility and moisture in the soil below. But this would add another variable to the trial and probably reduce the chance of getting valuable information relating to the different amendment and growing medium types. So I think I will try to continue to isolate these grow bags to see how far I can push these crops next year within each variation of amendment or growing medium confined within the bags. Because in the context of this trial, setting things up so that I can gain a better understanding of all the benefits and issues of the different approaches is more valuable to me than a bigger crop of potatoes, I think at least for another year. These grow bag trials were a really big part of the Red Gardens project this year, and I learned so much that it took 6 videos to explore a lot of the things that I learned and observed. If you value this type of trial and also appreciate the work that we do as part of this Red Gardens project, it would be great if you consider supporting our work and this channel. Links to my Patreon and PayPal accounts should be on the screen or in the description below. And I also wanted to really thank those people who have been supporting this channel for quite a while, as without your continuing support, we wouldn't have been able to do these big grow bag trials or continue with all the other work that we're doing in this Red Gardens project. But most importantly, I want to thank everyone for watching.